Hello supply chain friends. After I made my last video on the top 10 highest paying supply chain jobs in the US, a lot of my Canadian friends reached out to me and asked me to make a very similar video about Canada. So here I am with another exciting supply chain video where I will walk you through the top 10 highest paying supply chain jobs in Canada. And keep watching till the end because I will also share with you the comparison of similar supply chain jobs and their salaries between US and Canada, which is a very hot topic often in these job markets. And I will also share with you the 5 key factors which drive these differences in salaries between the two countries. My name is Jamil Hai and I've been working in supply chain management positions for the last 2 decades. And my mission is to help supply chain professionals like you build real life skills for your job and career that they don't teach you in college. And if you are preparing for a supply chain job interview anytime soon, you should definitely book a session with me because I'm going to take your resume, the job description you are applying for, and based on a combination of those two and my 2 decades of experience, will give you some laser guided tips and tricks which can maximize your chances of success. So go ahead and book your session today. So first, let's look at the 6 factors that typically affect salaries in any job market. There are 3 macro factors and then there are 3 individual factors. Let's look at the macro factors first. The first and the foremost macro factor is industry. Depending on which industry you are working in, your salary might be very different. Classical example in supply chain is that if you are working in a tech supply chain, for instance, if you are working in Meta or in Microsoft, chances are, although this is not always true, chances are that your compensation will be higher than, for instance, if you are working in a consumer goods company. Just because the margins and the kind of technology those companies are working on, there's far more injection of investment, cash, and all those other factors. So industry definitely plays a big role. And in fact, I've made this matrix which kind of gives you a little bit of a risk versus reward of different industries. So while in tech, you might be making a lot more money than, for instance, consumer goods or some of the other industries in the supply chain role, but the risk factor in technology jobs is much higher as well. There's a lot of hiring, firing you keep on seeing in companies like Google, Amazon. Whereas if you compare that with a consumer goods company, the careers are a little bit more stable, but of course then you earn less money there as well. Now, once again, this is not to say that, jobs are definitely secure in one industry versus the other. There is no such thing as job security in today's market. If the company doesn't need you or it's not doing very well financially, they will not even think about a second before letting go of you. Especially as you grow further in the organization, the risk becomes higher because your salary is higher, so your impact on the bottom line is higher as well, right? So not to say that this is linked to job security at all, but this just gives you an idea on the different kind of risk versus reward in different industries. So if you look at this graphic here, tech definitely high risk, high reward. But then if you go down this graphic here, energy, high reward, the risk is relatively balanced because energy requires a very specific skill set. So for example, if you are a supply chain manager in an oil and gas company, chances are that you will be spending the majority of your career there because it's a very specialized supply chain. You're extracting oil from rigs offshore. There's a lot of different technicalities involved there. So working in that supply chain, I've seen very few people over the course of my career who have moved away from the oil and gas industry. Although, one can argue that oil and gas, of course, pays you well as well. That could be the reason. But of course, oil and gas have their own boom-bust cycles too. But it's a very specialized industry. And of course, as you go further down this graphic, you will see that, pharma, consumer goods, healthcare, in terms of rewards, probably much below the tech industry, but the risk is also relatively lower. Because as an example, when I was working at Procter & Gamble, jokingly we used to say that no matter what happens in the world, people will continue needing shampoos or soap, babies will continue needing diapers, right? So the demand for those products is far more stable as compared to, for instance, cell phones. Imagine if you were the supply chain manager of Nokia 20 years ago. Now, yes, your skills are transferable, but that technology is gone and new technology is coming. And of course, you would go through the rough, bumpy cycles of that industry as the time progresses. The second factor is company size. Of course, a $40 billion company will compensate differently than a $20 million company, right? So company size makes a big difference in the compensation as well. And then the third macro factor is location. Now, location is a macro factor which is very much pronounced in Canada as compared to some of the other markets. Why is that? Let me share with you some interesting graphics here. This is the heat map of the Canadian population, and you can see I've put three big circles there. The first and the biggest circle is on that bottom right, which is basically covering the Toronto area, the Kitchener-Waterloo area, all the way going up to Montreal. This is where the majority of the Canadian population lives, and I will share with you some interesting facts in a second. That's the biggest job center in Canada, followed by, you see the second bigger circle in the Vancouver, Victoria, the British Columbia region, and the third circle is basically the Calgary, Edmonton circle, where a lot of oil and gas and oil sands supply chain jobs are there. So these are the three big job centers. So if you are in these job centers, your chances of getting a job are much higher as compared to a Nova Scotia or a Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, why is this and what factors drive it? Let me share with you some interesting fun facts here. If you look at this other graphic here, you will see that 70% of Canadians live in 10% of the area. This is very interesting because Canada, I mean, if you look at it on the map, it's actually the second biggest country in the world after Russia. But it's the 36th largest country population wise. So it's a huge country with a very small population. And as a result of that, about 70% of Canadians live only in 10% of the land. And the other interesting fact is that 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, if you look at this graphic here. So a lot of jobs are dependent on the US economy as well. And this is why location becomes such an important factor. Now let's get to the individual factors. And the most important individual factor is your leadership and technical skills. You are rewarded for the skills you possess. So if you have leadership skills and a combination of technical skills in supply chain, your chances of getting a good package are much higher than someone who doesn't have both of these, or they just have, let's say, leadership skills and not too many technical skills. So in supply chain, that's why it's very important that you understand the technicalities of supply chain in general, but then you also have to build very strong leadership skills. Leadership skills are always rewarded more in any organization, more than the technical skills, because as a leader, you are much more impactful on the bottom line of the organization. Because if you are a good leader, if you are a good manager, you can get more work out of people, you can inspire more people, you can energize more people. So your overall impact on the company's bottom line is higher, and therefore you can expect to be rewarded more. This interesting graphic that you see in front of you right now kind of shows you that as you grow in your career, the importance of technical skills kind of doesn't diminish but goes down over time, and the importance of leadership skills goes up over time. So this is why a combination of these two skills is very important if you want to be compensated nicely from a salary point of view. The second individual factor is experience. Now, experience, a lot of times people just measure experience in terms of number of years. Of course, that's a huge factor, but it also depends on the richness of your experience. Imagine there is a supply chain manager who has worked in the same job for 20 years, right? And he or she has probably stayed in a very stable environment, not seen a lot of drama. It's been a smooth sailing for that person. But at the same time, there is another supply chain manager who has 12 years of experience. But that person has seen a lot of transformations. They have worked in different parts of the business, or they have worked in different companies, and they have got a lot of different variety of industries, and they have seen a lot of different, let's say, boom bust cycles and how supply chains have operated in those. That person is far more valuable from a salary attractiveness perspective, because although this person has fewer years of experience, but that experience is much richer and there is much more variety in that experience. So when you look at experience, just don't look at the number of years, but also look at the depth of experience. That's why one of the things you should always think about from a career planning perspective for yourself is try to do different roles every couple of years or every 3 or 4 years. Because if you stay in one job for, let's say, more than 3 years, then in today's time and age, probably you are not doing the best justice to your career. And the last factor is certifications. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on certifications because I've made a separate video on do certifications matter in supply chain, and that's the video where I've covered all the situations in which certifications become very important. And there is a very different role of certification in supply chain, which I've covered in that video. So definitely go ahead and watch that. So now let's move to the top 10 highest paying supply chain jobs in Canada. And the first one is supply chain analyst. So a supply chain analyst, entry level, you can expect to be compensated between $55,000 and $70,000. And when I say dollars, I'm talking about Canadian dollars here. Mid level is between $70,000 and $90,000, and senior level is between $90,000 and $100,000. Sometimes it can be a little bit higher as well. On number 9 is transportation manager. Now, before I show you the salary numbers for this, one thing I want to touch on is that transportation and logistics are probably the most demanded skills in Canada, because in Canada, more than manufacturing, there is logistics happening. Because remember, Canada is a huge country, so you have to spend a lot of money, a lot of time in moving stuff between one part of the country to another. There is railway involved, there are highways involved, there are warehouses involved. Now, talking about the salary range of the transportation manager, the entry level once again would be anywhere between $55,000 and $70,000. Mid level is $70,000 to $90,000, and the senior level can be $90,000 to $120,000, and could be even higher at times. On number 8, we have got our famous demand and supply planner jobs, and the entry level salary for a demand or supply planner in Canada would be once again $55,000 to $70,000 is kind of that standard range. On the lower side, the mid level, it could go all the way up to $90,000, and the senior level, you could be making also sometimes up to $130,000 depending on the size of the company in terms of demand and supply planner salaries. Now, just a reminder that I have made videos on demand planner job interview preparation and supply planner job interview preparations, which you can watch by clicking on the links which you just saw on your screen. Now, on number 7, we have got the production manager. Production manager jobs are mostly in factories, so these are manufacturing jobs. And the entry level salary you can expect in a production manager role is between $65,000 and $75,000. At the mid level, up to $100,000, and then as a senior level, as a senior production manager, you could be earning up to $140,000 as well. Next is logistics manager. So logistics manager is basically an overall role, which is not only covering the transportation aspect, which you saw the transportation manager job just now, but it also covers warehousing, logistics strategy, and all of those kind of things. Now, logistics manager salaries in Canada at the entry level could be up to $80,000, mid level up to $110,000, and then senior levels could be up to $140,000 or sometimes even higher. On number 5, we've got procurement manager, and just a reminder of our score model that procurement and purchasing roles sit underneath that sourcing umbrella of our plan, source, make, deliver, and return model. So sometimes people consider procurement as something completely separate from supply chain, and rightfully so, because the skill levels are different, but procurement is very much a part of the end-to-end supply chain. And as a procurement manager in Canada, you could be earning up to $90,000 at the entry level jobs, $120,000 at the mid level, and at a senior level, you could be making around $120,000 to $150,000 in terms of your base salary. Supply chain manager is number 4. And of course, as you get further into these senior manager positions, there is no entry level here. So in case of supply chain manager, your mid-level salary would be $100,000 to $130,000, but at the senior level, you could be making up to $160,000 Canadian dollars in terms of salary. Now, on number 3, we get to procurement director. So now we are getting to director level positions, and a procurement director in Canada at a mid level could be earning anywhere between $120,000 and $180,000, and at the senior level, he or she could be making between $180,000 to $250,000 or more, depending once again on the size of the company and the scope of the procurement role they are doing. Sometimes if it's company which is based in Canada, or you are doing a remote role from Canada and you're looking after global procurement and purchasing, then of course your compensation would also be relatively higher. On number 2, we have a supply chain director, and a supply chain director in Canada, mid-level salaries between $120,000 to $180,000, senior level salaries $180,000 to $250,000 and above. And with that said, finally we move to the supply chain vice president salaries, and a VP in Canada in supply chain would be making at the mid level $200,000 to $300,000. The very senior level, you could be making $300,000 to $500,000 or even more. And remember, when we say $500,000 or more, at those levels, when you become a senior director or VP, a big part of your compensation becomes the bonus of the company as well, right? So you have a pretty big stake in the performance of the company, because as compared to a junior employee who is getting only a small chunk of the bonus most of the times, at that senior level, you get a much larger chunk depending on whatever company policies. Then therefore your compensation can be really high as long as the company performs well. Now let's move to the spicy topic of comparing jobs between US and Canada. And we are in a very good position now to do this, because you just saw the Canadian salaries. I have covered the US salaries in a separate video. And I will share with you, first of all, the differences for most of the jobs we have covered in these videos. And then I'll talk to you about the 5 factors which drive these differences. So let's look at this table here, which is basically what I've done here is that I've compared most of the jobs which I covered in both these videos, and I've taken the average salary at the senior level just to give you that benchmarking. And in the first column here, for all the jobs you see in the roles, from the supply chain analyst all the way to the supply chain VP, I've put that average senior level salary in Canadian dollars, which I just covered with you. In the second column, you see the conversion of that salary into US dollars based on today's exchange rate, which is pretty high. And in the third column, I have taken the salaries from the previous video of what these same roles would be getting on an average at the senior level in the United States. And as you look at that comparison, you will see that on an average between US and Canada, you could be making up from 30% all the way to 60% more in the US in a similar supply chain job. And you might be wondering, these countries are so close, why is there such a big difference, right? Let me just tell you the 5 reasons which I think are the main reasons of why there is such a big difference. And this difference, I must admit, has increased over time, and I will talk to you about one factor which has changed significantly between US and Canadian economies over the last 10 or 14 years. So the number one reason why you get higher salaries relatively in supply chain, and I think this applies to a lot of other industries as well, is there is a significant oversupply of talent in the main Canadian job markets. Now, why am I saying that, right? Because you would argue that, US has got far more people. It's a much bigger population. So why am I saying that Canada, which is actually 1/8 the population, and we'll cover the population aspect in a second. Why am I saying that Canada has got an oversupply of talent? Well, there are 2 big reasons for that. If you think about the Canadian population, right, there are 2 types of Canadians. One is Canadians who have been living here for generations, born and raised here. That's one group. And then, of course, there is the other group, which is this immigrant population, which, of course, Canada relies heavily on immigration. So there's a lot of immigration happening all the time. So we'll analyze these 2 separately. The population which has been living here, let's say generationally, and they are based in Canada, not just from this generation, but for the last couple of generations. One of the things I've observed in the Canadian job market is that people in one city tend to live in that same city for the entirety of their careers. So if you come across a Canadian, let's say, professional who is based in Toronto, chances are that that person has lived in Canada for the majority of their career span. Now, of course, there are always exceptions. I'm not generalizing or stereotyping here. Don't get me wrong here, but I'm just talking about the general observation here. So you will see, similarly, people who live in Vancouver will want to spend most of their careers in the Vancouver, Victoria, British Columbia region. Whereas when you compare the same thing with the US, it's far more common for the American talent to move around the country. It's very common that, someone started, their elementary education in Chicago, and then they moved to Tennessee for their first job, and then that first job took them to another job in Dallas, and they spent a few years there, and they keep moving around depending on where the job opportunity takes them. So people are far more open in terms of moving in the US than Canada, and that basically spreads out the talent. So there isn't the massive oversupply talent problem in the US versus Canada because of that one reason. Second reason is I will talk about the immigration aspect. Now, Canada is heavy on immigration. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there's no immigration happening in the US. Of course, the US is also a very immigration-oriented country, but as a percentage of total population, Canada relies far more on immigration than the US. And when it comes to supply chain, you need people who are highly skilled in certain areas. And when you look at the immigration program, because I have done this immigration process myself, and I came 10 years ago to Canada following something called the Federal Skilled Worker Programs, which basically I would say is the biggest source of immigration-oriented talent into the supply chain market and a lot of other, let's say, technical industries. Those people, when they come to Canada, they would mostly go into some very selected cities. Very few people will go to cities like Halifax or, Regina or Winnipeg, right? Most people who immigrate to Canada would either go to Toronto or Vancouver or to Montreal, because these are the three main job centers. And because of that, all the talented immigrant population is concentrated in these job markets, and therefore one is the bigger reason. And of course, when you have a lot of oversupply of talent, then it's a basic demand supply and rule at play here, right? So then the compensation goes down because more people are chasing fewer jobs basically in the market. So that is the number one factor, in my opinion, why the salaries are relatively lower in Canada. Now, of course, there are other factors, and let's look at factor number 2, which is population. Now, if you look at this graphic here, and I deliberately picked this particular graphic because from a world map or a North American map perspective, Canada looks like a huge country. But when you look at the population, Canada has a population of about 40 million and US has a population of 350 million. So US is almost 8 times bigger than Canada. In fact, until a few years ago, US was almost 10 times bigger than Canada. One of the reasons why that gap has kind of gone down a little bit is because in the last few years, Canadian immigration has completely gone out of control. And I don't want to turn this into a political video, but there are reasons why that happened. But as we speak right now, Canada has about 40 million people and US is about almost 350 million people, which means US is an 8 times bigger market. And when you have an 8 times bigger market, you have more consumers, and those consumers are actually, we'll look at the GDP per capita in a second. Those consumers have a higher purchasing power, which means that the chances of consumer goods or technology goods selling in the US are much more than Canada, and therefore the demand for supply chain professionals who are required to move those products around is also higher. The third factor is economy. Now, this is a very interesting graphic here. Canada and US GDP per capita, there is a significant delta in them now. So right now, from a GDP per capita perspective, US is 1.5 times more productive than Canada. And this is the one factor which I was alluding to earlier on, which has changed significantly in the last 15 years. If you even look at this graphic here, not too long ago, probably around that 2010, 2011 time, US and Canada productivity was almost the same, around $53,000 US per capita, which by the way is really high if you compare with some of the developing markets and so on. But over the last 15 years, US has really taken off. And now US per capita GDP is about $82,000 and Canada is still at around $53,000. And that makes a point that the consumers have a higher spending power, which basically fuels the demand for more goods, more services, and hence more supply chain professionals. Now, this particular factor has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Once again, I don't want to turn this into an economics class, but just want to call out that one of the factors which is also driving the stellar growth of the US economy over the last 14-15 years is that US debt per capita is also significantly higher than Canada. And of course, you keep hearing in the news about US taking all, significant amount of debt and all of that. And when you have a lot of debt oriented growth in the market, then of course there's more cash. There is more dollars chasing fewer products, which fuels more demand for those products. And when that happens, of course, wages go up, and supply chain is no exception. And if you are interested in these topics more, and I definitely don't want to turn this into an economics class, you should definitely read these two books which you see on the screen, The House of Debt by Atif Mia and The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. These are one of the best books on country economies and even personal financial management. I really wish I had read especially The Psychology of Money maybe 20 years ago, because I would not have made a lot of financial decisions that I made over the course of my life, right? So these are two excellent books, and strongly recommend you buy and read them. And if you are interested, I'll put a link of these two books in the body of this video, so you can definitely purchase them from Amazon. The fourth factor is corporate taxes. US is a much more attractive market for businesses to invest and grow their businesses as compared to Canada, because in the US, corporate taxes are somewhere around that 20% mark. In fact, one of the big topics or debating points in the last election that Donald Trump just won was that Trump is promising to lower the taxes even more. And when you compare that with Canada, Canada could have as high as 38% corporate tax. So if you had, let's say, $1 million and you wanted to start a business, and you don't have any restrictions whether you can pick Canada, you can pick the US, chances are that as a business person, as a business owner, you will probably invest in the US because it's a much more attractive market from a business standpoint. And this is factor number 4, why there are more businesses there, more goods and services there, and therefore more salaries in the supply chain domain. And finally, of course, currency rate plays a big difference. Right now, the US to Canada exchange rate is somewhere around 1.38, so closing to 1.4. It's typically, if you look at 10-year cycles, it's always between 1.15 and 1.4, depending on how the two economies are doing. Right now, of course, Canadian economy is not doing as well as the US, so there the currency difference is also higher, driven by some of the other economic factors there. But of course, this plays a big role in the differences in salaries as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've also made videos on topics like customer supply chain manager interview question and answers and supply chain KPIs. So you can watch those by clicking over here. Keep watching.